this Thursday, 119 men were killed by an explosion in the Benwood Mine of wheeling steel. I first heard of Joseph Tellitocci of Boggs Run, Benwood, when I was doing research on the so-called Benwood Mine Disaster for one of my own projects. I could see right away that he did meticulous research. He was very concerned with getting it right so that the men who died at least had their names correct. One of the books here inspired him because many of the names were wrong. One of the men who died was his own great-grandfather. I'll let him tell the story. We should be motivated by accuracy and truth and history, and that's what Joey is, and I'm happy that he's here today. Joey Tellitocci.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
As Sean said, my name is Joey Tellitocci. Boston, as most of us people know us by. But I'm here today to talk about the 1924 Benwood Mine Disaster. As Sean said, it had a profound effect on the community where I live, Boggs Run, Benwood, and my own family. My maternal grandmother's father, Istvan, Vargo, was a Hungarian immigrant. He was killed in the mine. And on my dad's side of the family, my maternal grandfather, Joseph Tellitocci Sr., his mother lost her first husband in the mine, Istvan. So how this basically all got started about 2 years ago for the 85th anniversary of the mine disaster. I contacted the Wheeling News Register to see if they were going to do any follow-ups about the anniversary of the mine, because I know, in years past they have. So they were gracious enough. They interviewed me and they ran a story in the paper, and basically, as Sean mentioned, one of the things that always bothered me was when I would see the lists, and being that more than half the men were immigrants from Europe. They got here in the early 20th century. A lot of the names were misspelled, and a lot of people would look for their grandfathers, fathers, relatives, and they really had a hard time deciphering who it actually was, because the names were misspelled so bad. So that's one of the things I really wanted to try to work on, was to give proper identification to the 119 men that were killed in the mine explosion. And so that's kind of what brings me here today. So I have a PowerPoint show here, and the disaster, of course, it occurred on It was April 28, 1924, at the Monday, April 28, 1924. It was at the Benwood Mine of the Wheeling Steel Corporation, which is now closed. The mill's still there down in center Benwood as you go up into South Benwood. The explosion, accounts vary about the actual time of the explosion. I read one account where one of the men's watch stopped at 7:04 a.m. So they usually put the explosion occurring around 7:05 a.m. And this was about 25 minutes after the last of the men had entered the mine and to take their stations at their workplace. There were 119 men killed, and there were no survivors in this explosion. As I mentioned, the majority of the miners killed were European immigrants of the early 20th century, and later on I have a breakdown of the nationalities and the number killed from each ethnicity. And the disaster, the 1924 disaster in Benwood, was the third worst mine disaster in West Virginia. Exactly 10 years prior to the date, on April 28, 1914, the second worst occurred at the Eccles Mine in Raleigh County, West Virginia, which killed 183 men. The worst to date occurred on December 6, 1907 at the Fairmont Coal Company in Monongah, West Virginia. That explosion killed 361 men. So I found this document online. It gives the name of each West Virginia mining disaster all the way through the Sagan mine disaster last year in 2010. So this is a really great reference. And, but it's just eerie that exactly 10 years to the day, here we are again, the disaster plagues the mines once again. The explosion. Most people don't realize that, and I didn't even realize it until I actually started doing the research, that there are actually 2 explosions that happened that morning. They say the first explosion was in a pocket of methane gas, which had collected near the entryway in the mine shaft. The second explosion was dust, coal dust most likely, and that was raised into the air and ignited by the methane explosion. And the second explosion was believed to have caused the deaths of the miners. The mine was dry and dusty, sprinkling and ventilation were poor back then, and basically that dust explosion carried the explosion to all areas of the mine, so there really wasn't much of a chance for anyone to survive. The causes of death, of course, the explosion I read was so violent, it hurled the men hundreds of feet into the air and crushed them against the ribs of the coal. And of course, the roofs collapsed and they were crushed by avalanches of rock, slate, and other debris. Those close to where the explosion ignited were burned to death. But a lot, in many cases, after dam, also referred to as black dam, was determined to be the cause of the death of many of the miners. After dam is deadly gases, such as carbon monoxide, which collects in the mine after a fire or an explosion. And when the rescue teams went into the mine, they found that many of the men had items of clothing, such as handkerchiefs, their shirts, coats, that they tried to shield themselves from the gases. But, of course, none of that proved very successful. And I actually have come to believe that my great-grandfather may have been the victim of after dam, because I remember my grandmother telling me my grandma was 2 months away from turning 6 years old on the day it happened. And she actually remembered his funeral, the wake at the house. Back then, the bodies were laid out in the parlor of the home. And she remembered viewing and seeing his body, and she doesn't really remember that he was, horribly mangled or disfigured. He did have some burns, but he pretty much was intact for the most part. The news reports of the day, as I said, there were 119 victims, but only about 104 men went through the proper check-in procedure. So when the explosion first occurred, they presumed anywhere from 104 to 110 were to be in the mine at the time. But of course, later they found out that there were additional men that had gone into the mine to work that day. They just didn't go through the proper check-in procedure, so that's why they were unaware of their presence there. The rescue and recovery efforts. I think I've read various accounts of the brave men and women who aided in this effort. And basically, the first few days there was hope that maybe some of the miners had barricaded themselves and shielded themselves from the afterghan. But as I'll talk about later, that pretty much all of it was lost after a couple of days when more bodies were discovered. But it was a slow, difficult, and extremely dangerous process due to a number of factors. For one, we still had the presence of afterghan, the poisonous gases which killed the miners themselves, those that were killed in the explosion. The roof had collapsed and the haulage ways were destroyed. The rescue teams had to dig their way through fallen rock and debris and crawl through small spaces to get to the larger areas to search for any survivors. After they got so far into the mine through the main entry down in Center Benwood, they had to shift the recovery and rescue efforts to the air shaft at Boggs Run. I don't know if you're familiar, Boggs Run is an area at Benwood. If you keep going out Boggs Run Road, Boggs Run bisects with Boggs Run, and there's an air shaft out that way. There was a second entrance into the mine. So they were able to dig through the first obstacle of fallen rock and debris, but then they got so many more feet back in, and they just, there was nothing they could do. It was going to take too long, and it was already going into a couple days, so they shifted all the recovery efforts to the Boggs Run air shaft. They worked around the clock through relay teams every 750 feet. Minutes after the explosion, there were rescue teams that came to Benwood. Some of the places they came from were, there was the Hitchman coal and coke mine down towards South Benwood. Crews came from there. Glendale, Blair, Ohio, miners came over. Bridgeport from the United Mine Workers. Stephenville, Ohio, Pittsburgh, and as far away as Cincinnati and Williamson, West Virginia. Also, there are nurses from the Wheeling chapter of the American Red Cross and a number of Wheeling physicians, I believe 5 or so, were on the scene as well. So, once news spread about the explosion, of course, all of the women and the children of the miners, they rushed to the scene, hysterically screaming, sobbing, asking for word of their loved ones trapped in the mine. Now, to remember, more than half of them didn't speak English, so it was hard to communicate the information to them. But they, the wives, the children, the mothers, the fathers, the brothers and sisters of the miners, they kept constant vigil on the hillside outside of the main entrance, and then after recovery efforts shifted out to Boggs Run, they also kept vigil there. The first day, and I read an article, and it kind of makes sense as it is about a sympathy, for the horrible disaster. A heavy rain fell, drenching rain, but they were totally unmindful of that. They just were waiting to hear, did my husband survive? My father and my brother. So they pretty much stayed there through the entire week and just waiting for word. Once the news of the explosion reached Wheeling and other parts, basically crowds of the curious onlookers pretty much invaded Benwood, and news reporters from different media outlets such as the Moundsville Daily Echo, the Tellitocci, they came to Benwood. I read one account where a gentleman who works for the Tellitocci, because they were trying to keep them, away from the entrance. And what one of the guys did was he rented a room from a gentleman that lived near the Boggs Run shaft. So, like he said, for all intents and purposes, they couldn't throw him out because he lived there. He was able to report most of the information. One story that I heard, actually just a couple days ago, is a widow who hasn't been identified, but upon receiving the news that her husband had died, tried to drown herself in the Ohio River. Of course, the crowds, saw what she was trying to do, and they rescued her. And then another thing that I didn't realize until recently was, you know, you had, like I said, you had all these crowds. They were on the railroad tracks. You know, they were surrounded the mine industry waiting for word. And Mrs. Caroline Melcher, age 86 of Wheeling, who was an onlooker in the crowd, she was actually struck and killed by a speeding truck that was rushing supplies to the rescue teams on April 30th. So not only did you have the tragedy that, you know, killed the miners, and you had the chaos above ground with you know, the relatives and the onlookers, and then so out of that tragedy was born this tragedy. This is a picture I found on the internet. This is the mill down in center Benwood. This is outside of the main entrance. And this was taken on April 29th, 1924. This was the day after the explosion. And you can see the crowds of people, the small children, the women, they're waiting for word here in the loved ones. This is a picture of the air shaft out of the Boggs Run entrance, and this is on the West Virginia Division of Culture and History website. And this shows them recovering the body from the air shaft. And you can see the people standing around the hillside. More with the rescue and recovery, they actually found 2 men alive in the air shaft. However, when the rescue teams tried to revive them, they both died before being brought to the surface. And during the first few days, there was that glimmer of hope that maybe some of the men who had not been killed in the explosion, you know, had been able to survive the aftermath by, you know, covering their noses or their mouths with cloths and things. And of course, this is before, you know, the gas mask, which actually this disaster led to, which I'll get to later. They set up temporary morgues in Benwood. The first one was at the Coon Bent's building in center Benwood, and then they shifted it to the old Blue Ribbon Company, which is across from Monday's Family Restaurant down on Main Street in Benwood. And as with all the fallen debris and the obstacles that they had to overcome, of course by this time, you know, you had the miners had been there for a couple of days, and the overpowering odor of decaying bodies, which was another thing that the rescue teams had to endure. The process they came up with was when the corpse was discovered, they each received a tag, and they noted the place on the tag where they were found. They were brought to the shaft bottom, and then the physicians that were at the scene disinfected the corpses before they brought them to the outside, because they didn't want any kind of disease or any kind of outbreak, you know, to spread. However, by Friday, they had discovered a total of 76 bodies, and they pretty much informed those that kept vigilant at the entrance and at the air shaft that pretty much all hope for any chance of survival was gone, and the families then prepared to bury their dead. And an account that I read says the last of the bodies was removed from the mine on May 6th, and they declared the recovery efforts over by that time. And then, of course, the funerals got underway. Actually, some accounts say that most of the funerals got underway after that date. But I know that there are miners buried before that, the ones that were found in the early part of the recovery efforts. My great-grandfather, for instance, him and the 2 other Hungarians killed with him, who were his good friends, one of them being my grandmother's godfather. They were buried on May 2nd in Mount Calvary. This, of course, this is the photo that I had enlarged. This is in section 12 of Mount Calvary Cemetery in Wheeling. 22 miners were interred during this mass burial funeral. This occurred on May 5th, 1924. In the center there, the priest presiding over it was actually the pastor of the church I belong to, St. John Roman Catholic Church in Benwood. That was Father Peter Sheridan. He was the pastor at the time. There were 3 languages spoke at this funeral: Polish, Italian, English. And as you see, many of the men, they hold the Italian flag. And, this is just kind of zoomed out, another angle of that picture. This is facing towards, if you go up into section 12, which I've spent a lot of time up there researching, trying to decipher the tombstones of the miners, trying to get the names correct. And this is that area. This is that area. This is another view. You see the cars all lined up. And you actually, if you look, you can see down towards the bottom right-hand corner, you can see where the first picture was taken. And then if you notice over to the left, there's another mass burial. So there are actually different spots that was going on. Now this is a view if you're facing towards the back of the cemetery. And I actually walked out here yesterday. This tombstone here, Frank Sablick, is still there, along with a couple of little crosses. And this is after the funeral. As you can see, the grave diggers are filling in the graves, and there's some women and men there after the funeral. I took this picture last summer. It was very touching and overwhelming. The day that the story came out in April 2009, I received numerous phone calls from relatives, descendants of the miners, giving me their accounts of what happened, and stories that were passed down through their family, through the generations. And I actually had a gentleman, mine disaster victim, John Dupla, his grandson contacted me. He lives in Texas. And they had been out in Mount Calvary trying to find the grave of his grandfather. And they were unsuccessful. So I told him, I'd go out and look. And, so his gravestone is right. I need the mouse here. Sorry. It's towards the center there. And the writing on it, most of the stones were sandstone. So a lot of the writing has worn off, unfortunately. Some of them are still legible. A lot of the stones used to have pictures of the miners on there. Some of them still do have survived, but it's very difficult now to see the names. And of course, most of the inscriptions are written in the miners' native languages as well. So I went out and I photographed this, and I sent it to Mr. Dupla. He was very appreciative. They had come up to Wheeling. Actually, my younger brother got married last July, and they had come up that weekend, so I was out of town. And they had gone out to look. Of course, the administration office wasn't open, so they pretty much left to their own devices. But luckily, I was able to go out and find it for him, so now he has a picture of it. This picture was taken. This is my great-grandfather's tombstone. Him and 2 other Hungarian miners, they're buried down in Section 8, which is kind of diagonal. If you have the hillside up here, and then if you come like diagonal in that area, there are a couple other miners there as well. And this was taken, as you can see, he still had the picture on his tombstone. Looks like there was a rose bush planted. There's a lot of pictures of the old family collection of my grandma, great aunts and uncles posing by the tombstone. And this happened to be, I believe this particular photo came from my great aunt who passed away in January. She let me this photo to scan. This is a picture that appeared in the paper 2 years ago. And this is what it looks like today. As you can see, the pictures have fallen off, and The miner buried next to him here, one of the crosses has fallen off since then. I had my great aunt, who would be the youngest daughter of my great-grandfather. She had not been born yet. My great-grandmother was about 2 months pregnant with her, and before Aunt Rosie died, she had my great-grandfather's stone that pretty much fell into the same state where the cross had come off, but she talked to the cemetery and had it fixed. So, I was always grateful for her for doing that. Now this kit, I found this out and it just kind of totally blew my mind. A relief effort. Well, in all the stories my grandmother told me, we never heard of great-grandma Rose receiving any kind of money or anything, after the mine disaster, nor my great-grandmother Tellitocci after her husband was killed. But apparently, at this time, the Bank of Benwood was still in operation, and the city, a relief fund was established for the widows and the children of the miners. 2 men who worked at the bank embezzled the money, and the money was never recovered. So anything that would have gone to the widows and the children, they didn't receive. The men were caught, however, and they each received a 10-year sentence in the West Virginia State Penitentiary. And due to that act of embezzlement and other corruption going on with the Bank of Benwood folded in June of 1925 as well. So that's, here you have this great tragedy, and another thing to compound it. I have one account here that says that each miner's family received $500 of insurance. I haven't found anything to corroborate that. The only thing that makes me think that they may have received something is the fact that my great-grandfather's grave is even marked, because 3 years prior to that, they had lost a daughter in infancy, and her grave was never marked until last year. So the mill may have paid for the gravestones. I'm really not sure about that. But, so they may have received some money, and the amount that was stolen, of course, was never published. So I'm not sure exactly what they actually got away with. Just goes to show in these disasters, it brings out the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. And of course, this is one of those cases where you see the worst of humanity. The aftermath of the Benwood Mine disaster, they say, led to safety measures, because back then there really weren't a lot of safety measures, if any. I've heard different things where the inspector went in that morning and didn't do a very thorough job of inspecting it and just said it's fine, go to work. Of course, that's just something that's been passed down through our city and things. Whether that's true or not, but the self-contained self-rescuer, those are the masks now that miners carry with them, and it's been theorized that had the men had these masks, the ones that died of the aftermath possibly could have survived, but we'll never know for sure. And then another safety measure it led to was rock dusting. But of course, Benwood, 18 years later, on Monday, May 18, 1942, we had another mine disaster occur at the Hitchman Coal and Coke mine. 5 men were killed in that explosion, but there were a number of men who did survive that. These are some of the stories that have been passed down through my family, through people that I've talked to. The most well-known story that my grandma always said was great-grandfather was very ill the morning of the explosion. He actually was considering not going to work that day because of how ill he was, but these are the days before workers' compensation, sick days, so it was either work or starve, So he went, and unfortunately, minutes after, he was dead. Other stories I've heard throughout town where there were miners that had different premonitions that, they got the feeling not to go to work that day, to stay home. Of course, April 28th, in 1924, the Christian Easter was 1 week prior to the explosion. The Eastern Orthodox Easter was the Sunday directly before the explosion. And they said some of the miners of Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Russian descent that belonged to that religion had taken the day off to celebrate. So normally they would have been working that day shift. So by not being there, they survived. This is a list of the victims, which I compiled back in 2009. You can find these online. A historian that was originally from this area, Linda Cunningham Fluharty, I had contacted her after I did the story in the paper, and she was kind enough to publish my research on her website. She maintains the Marshall County, West Virginia Gen Web website. So if you go on that website and you go to events into the disaster, you'll see this list. And so these are all 119 of the men. Sean actually helped me a couple days ago when he broke the men down by nationality and mine occupation. There was a list published on the West Virginia Division of Culture and History website that has all 119 names, but of course the names are all spelled wrong. Nationalities are misidentified, so we kind of worked on this. As you can see, the greatest number of immigrants killed were Polish at 39, followed by Italian at 30, and Greek at 15. 9 American, those who were born here in the United States. Austrian, I'm not sure exactly if it was actually German-speaking Austrians, as we would think, but at that time, all that part of Europe was part of Austria-Hungary, and a lot of them just identified themselves as Austrians. So they may be Slovak or other nationalities, I'm not sure. And then, of course, you have Scottish, Hungarian, Russian, Serbian, Croatian, Lithuanian, English, Ukrainian, and Welsh. And my great-grandfather, he was a loader in the mine, and as you can see, there were 75 loaders that were killed. Both the fire boss and the mine boss were killed along with the men. They were in the mine. There were 3 sets of fathers and sons, John Frank Jr. and John Frank Sr., George Holliday Sr. and George Holliday Jr., they were the mine boss, George Holliday Sr. was, Walter and Alexander Snedden. 5 sets of brothers were killed, Michael and Rocco Capobianco, George and Hugh McGill, Gaetano and Raffaello Vitilio, Albert and John Slaga, and Isidore and Andy Shaleka. And then, just going through the death certificates, I kind of determined that these men had to be cousins because they had different sets of parents. Stanley and John Golubuski, John and Vincent Rivera, and Samuel Vitilio, who was a cousin to Gaetano and Raffaello Vitilio. This is my great-grandfather, Istvan, which is the Hungarian form of Stephen Vargo. He was referred to as Steve. That's what they died in darkness. That's how he's published in the book of Steve Vargo. So he was 36 years old when the day he was killed. And this is one of the few pictures we actually have of him. My grandma had this, it was in her possession, and she gave a copy to her sister, who of course had not been born yet. And my mother's cousin was kind enough to scan this photo and send it down to me. So now we have a nice picture of great-grandfather Vargo. This is how the family looked on that day. Great-grandfather was 36, my great-grandmother was 30. Granduncle Lou's 10 years old, Stephen, 8 years. My grandma was Julia Vargo. She was 2 months away from turning 6. And youngest, Teresa, who they call Teddy, was a year and a half. And then, of course, my great-grandmother was pregnant with my great-aunt Rose, and she was born 6 months and 13 days later. Stories told to the family was that different people in the neighborhood approached great grandma Rose to adopt Aunt Rosie, but she wasn't about to adopt any of her children. 3 years prior to this, they suffered a tragedy. They had an infant daughter, also named Teresa, who died in 1921. And of course, my Vargo great-grandparents all immigrated from Istvan, Hungary in 1914, along with their oldest child, Louis, and they came directly to Boggs Run, Benwood, West Virginia, where my great-grandfather found work in the coal mines. This is my great-grandmother, Rosalia Rose. Her maiden name was Varga, and she married Varga. The Vargo name was changed to Elisab, and it was Varga. If you go to Hungary, you won't find anything other than Vargo. They dropped the A with the O. And her maiden name, so she married a man by the same name, but they weren't related. The research that I've done, it was a small town, a lot of people had the same surnames. So that's her in her younger years and later years. These are the siblings. My great-uncle Lou, great-uncle Bunny, my grandma, in the corner there, great-aunt Teddy, and then great-aunt Rosie. Aftermath of my family, my great-grandmother remarried to another Hungarian immigrant coal miner, Istvan. He had come to America from Zolny, Hungary in 1908 and resided in Boggs Run. And they had 2 additional children together, my great-uncle Babe and my great-aunt Erzi. This is Pasquale Fana. This was the first husband of my great-grandmother Tellitocci, the mother of my paternal grandfather, Joseph Tellitocci. He lived in Belair, and he was a trapman in the mine. He was also killed in the explosion. And as you can see, he was 42 years old, my great-grandmother 32. And they had 4 children, Rita, Virginia, Armin, and Edith. Edith is still alive. She resides in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. She'll be 87 later this year. They too had lost an infant daughter a couple years prior. And Pasquale himself, his first wife, an infant son, both died of tuberculosis 10 years before the explosions. And he saw much tragedy in his short life, and they, of course, resided in Belair. This is my great-grandmother, Maria, my dad's paternal grandmother. The aftermath from that, from this side of the family, my great-grandmother remarried to my great-grandfather, Luigi Tellitocci, and he was an Italian immigrant, also a coal miner. He immigrated from Vargo, Italy in 1910, resided in Belair, and he was a coal miner at Rail River No. 6 mine in Belmont County. So then they had 3 children together, my great-uncle Colombo, my grandfather there in the center, and my great-uncle Alfred, who's still living. Memorial. This is probably the question I get asked about the most. Why isn't there a memorial? And I really don't have a definitive answer to that. Luckily, after my research came out in 2009, the West Virginia Division of Culture and History did erect one of their historical highway markers on South Marshall Street in Benwood to commemorate the disaster. But 87 years later, there's still a memorial. There's still no monument that would identify the 119 victims of the disaster. And here's a picture of the highway marker that they erected in 2009. And you can see that as you come from the south of Benwood to Center Benwood, or Center Benwood to the south of Benwood. And finally, I want to dedicate this to my grandma. If it wasn't her grandma, she's the one that, I was 13 when she died, but towards, the end of her life, we talked a lot about family history and genealogy, and she's what inspired me to actually do this. When Sean first approached me about it, I was kind of hesitant because I haven't really given a presentation since my college days, but I knew Grandma would want me to do it, so I know she's here with us undoubtedly, so thank you, Grandma. I wanted to read, I found this editorial. This was actually published in the Intelligencer the day after the explosion, and it pretty much sums up everything that the people were going through at that time. Editorial of the Benwood Mine Disaster. As the horrible, shocking details of the terrible Benwood Mine Disaster became known yesterday, the heart of the whole Wheeling community went out to those who had suffered and to the despairing families left behind. At 7:30 o'clock Monday morning, it says 125, but they're actually 119. Healthy, happy men, fathers, husbands, and sons were alive and well. Minutes after they had moved into the mountain of the Benwood Mine, it was Wheeling Steel Corporation, they were dead. In the face of such appalling catastrophes, one necessarily ponders upon the reason for life and death, and what it is all about. Here today, and gone in the flickering of a second, all that now remains of the hardy men who left their homes in high spirits to take up their labors in the bowels of Mother Earth, there to wrest out the black treasure which men use for producing heat with which to melt, mold, and bake, is their charred and blast mutilated bodies. Some have been brought to the surface and conveyed to the homes surrounding familiar to them in life, and were now born women and children who loved and knew the blackened forms returned onto them. At this point, of course, they didn't know how the accident had happened. The Benwood Mine was one of the oldest in the area and extensive. It had been worked for years without mishap, with serious mishap, and it is understood that every precaution, every safety had been taken. Appliance had been taken to prevent the disaster. Yet without warning came the fatal blast that snuffed out the lives of more than 100 men. All that was humanly possible in the way of rescue work was underway shortly following the explosion, but such work necessarily slowed due to death-killing gases that filled the mine. Some of the bodies found near the air shafts were brought out, the fate of the others appeared sealed. Yet hope springs eternal in the human breast. Distracted women and children no doubt filled their minds with prayers that in some corner of the black underground passages might be huddled the living men who went forth in the morning to earn for them bread by the sweat of their brows. And of course, as we know, this was not to be. So that, like I said, I like to dabble in history, real big into genealogy, and I just wanted. It always bothered me that the 119 victims of the Benwood Mine. You read the list, you're lucky if you can make out the names. So that's why I do what I did, and I hope in the years to come to further refine this, because I know there's a lot that I probably still have misspelled, and work and research in this disaster, because it's certainly something that greatly impacted my life, changed the whole course of my family history, and many others as well. So that's all I have. Any questions? Yes.
The miners, they were employees for Benwood Steel, correct?
Yes, they were employed by the Woodlands.
UMW?
I'm sorry?
Were they members of the UMW?
I don't think so. Nothing that I've seen indicates that. Yes.
I'm just wondering if you can tell us where in Center Benwood the opening of the mine is, as well as the dedicated marker.
Okay, if you're familiar with Center Benwood, the Blair Bridge, if you go up that road going on to South Marshall Street, the actual portal, I don't know, I think has been sealed, but the marker is right outside of the old mine. It's like directly outside there, and you can see it from the highway. It's both sides.
Is it on the hillside or the?
It's right on the road. Like you go up the road and there will be houses here and the markers over here. Yes?
Did not Calvary donate those plots?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. I did a lot of research out at Mount Calvary, of course, the internet records and things. And nothing that I ever came across suggested that it was donated, but it kind of makes you think that they may have been, with how destitute the families were. But that's definitely something you might look into.
And the other miners that weren't Catholic, where were they buried?
Greenwood.
At Greenwood?
Greenwood. There are a number in Greenwood. The Greek miners, the majority of them are in Greenwood. My My great-grandmother's first husband, they were Mount Calvin, Blair, that's where they resided. There's some in Moundsville, in Green Lawn Cemetery. I saw some that were in Linwood, over in Lane. So they're, majority, I would say, are in Mount Calvin, Wheeling, and Greenwood, but they're pretty spread out in the area. Yes?
What's the website that you mentioned, West Virginia?
Yes, I have it here. The Division of Culture and History website, where it's www.westvirginiaculture.org. And I use that site a lot, especially with my genealogy, because they have all of the birth, death, and marriage records, death and marriage through 1870 on that site.
Are you spelling West Virginia or just W?
Just W, it's abbreviated, yeah. Yes?
When did the mine go back into operation after the explosion and recovery and all that?
It was quite a while, because after like the first couple of days, the mill completely shut down. Obviously, they didn't have a coal supply. But eventually they did repair it. And from what I've heard, parts of the old mine intersect the current Shoemaker console mine. They're not used, they're still sealed off. But I heard that there was an excavation some time ago where they actually did go into one of the caverns and they located original mine equipment left behind. But it was a while before they got it back up and running. Yes?
Did all the miners, did they recover all the bodies, or are there still bodies buried in that old mine?
Based on what I've read, the news accounts of the day only brings the fatality total up to about 115. I've seen some death certificates where there is no place of burial listed. So it's very, very, well, I would say that there probably were a couple that, that were just so, mangled by the explosion that they probably weren't able to recover anything from the miner. Probably are still entombed in the old mine. Yes?
Many in the room were not living when that happened. But most in the room were living on November 20th, 1968, where 78 miners died at Farmington, outside of Fairmont. I was living there at the time, worked for the telephone company, had occasion to go out to the facility with families gathered. This isn't quite as bad as stealing the money like the bankers did. This television crew from out of town taking pictures. I heard the interviewer say to this pregnant woman, said to his photographer, "Don't start shooting until I get her crying." I about went into him. My buddy was with me, or I'd have been in jail probably. Can you think of anything a person would do, obviously pregnant, and said, "Don't start filming until she's crying"?
Yes?
You mentioned there is no monument in honor of these individuals. Is that correct? I mean,
That's correct.
Is there anything that could be done, with the county commissioners possibly?
It's been mentioned about maybe contacting like the United Mine Workers or even the legislature in West Virginia. I don't have a picture of it, but the Eccles mine that happened in 1914, there's a beautiful monument, granite and bronze, which, down there on the site. And, I know I talked to other residents of Benwood and other relatives and people in the community, and, we'd love to see something like that. So, if there's any suggestions on how that could come about or what, I or anyone else could do to try to get that, please let me know. Yes?
I have three questions, actually. How many of the miners lived on Boggs Run Road itself? Two, were they living in company housing, or were they living in their own homes? I assume that they walked to work that day. And there was always rumors that the inspector that day had been to a party the night before and didn't show up. Can you verify that or give
I
us
heard
some
that
information on
story
that?
as well. The inspector was at a party, and the story I heard, he was intoxicated. He didn't show up. There was no company housing for this mine. They all lived in homes that they rented. A good number did live along Boggs Run. My great-grandfather, his two friends, the Shalekas, the Jalasics. A number of them lived in South Wheeling, North Wheeling, and as far down as Moundsville. But a good many of them were centered in the Benwood area. Yes?
My uncle was only 16 when he got killed in the mine. His father had passed away just 19 days before that. And he went in place of someone else. And when they found his body, they put him in Greenwood Cemetery until they found out that he was Polish and Catholic, and then they dug him back up and put him in Mount Calvary. But we also heard that they did receive $50 or $100 a family.
Okay. Like I said, my grandmother never could recall, two months away from turning 6. Yeah, there was a mass plot purchased in Greenwood. That was paid for by Wheeling Steel. And the men that they couldn't readily identify were buried in that plot. And then, pretty much by process of elimination, families came forward and were able to claim the remains, and they moved them to the cemetery originally. So a lot of the Catholic miners were brought to Mount Calvary. Yes?
I just wondered if the miners themselves had identification on them in some way, a number that would correspond to a list so that they would know who the deceased were.
In this news report from the day after, there's a number listed out from the mine. It's not like numerical order. And I don't know for sure, but I don't know if this was the work number. That's another thing. I don't know if they had name tags or,
I recall some of my elderly relatives when I was a child had little metal numbers, not the number itself, the badge. I wondered if that's how else would they identify these people?
Yeah, pretty much. You look at the death certificates, you see at the top, we'll have the tag and the number, and it just crossed out, thinking it's somebody else. In a lot of cases like that. Yes?
My father and my uncle both worked for Wheeling Steel at that time, and they helped to transport the bodies to, I'm sure, mortuaries. And I talked to switching gears, I talked to Monsignor Frederick Schwartz, and he said the bishop was very concerned that there be a church presence there. So Father Schwartz, I think he spoke Italian and maybe something else. So he sent him down to Boggs Run. And he was there for many days, I believe, comforting the people, and then would come and report back to the bishop. And I think I also saw a tag, and I'll have to look for it, unless you've seen them. They gave out tags to people to help with the cleanup or the people bringing out bodies.
Yes, a gentleman actually today brought me this article. This gentleman here died in 1949, James Blazier, 90 years old. He was one of the ones who helped in the recovery efforts. And of course, he worked for the city of Wheeling too, so he was expected to go to his normal job at the city, and then go and help aid with the recovery effort. He was actually honored and given a medal for his service for his recovery efforts. Yes?
What kind of light did they have in the mine? Because if I remember correctly, the men wore headpieces, headlamps, lit by carbide.
Carbide, yes.
And did they have any other electrical lines with light?
I've never heard of electrical. I've heard it referred to as open lights. That's another thing that they wanted to eliminate was the open flame. Of course, with going for gas and things. And I definitely know they had carbide. That much I know from my grandmother. Yes.
First of all, was there ever any effort made to provide some kind of funds for the widows and children of these miners? because in some cases they may have been the sole support of their families. Was there any kind of arrangement for them?
Well, like I mentioned, the city and the Bank of Benwood, had started took up a collection, raised so much money, but because the men stole the money, they didn't receive that money. But I've seen in other articles that there were other groups that did start, some relief efforts, so they probably did get, some money.
And also, Glenn,
Yeah.
was the second explosion, did it follow immediately after the
Yes.
first? And were the miners scattered throughout the mine shaft, or were they all pretty much?
They say that a lot of the miners, they found that there were spots where they worked. Of course, a number of them that were, where the explosion actually occurred, had been thrown hundreds of feet. But for the most part, like the miners who succumbed to after the end, they found them pretty much at their workstations. So they were pretty much all at their stations by the time. It was only a matter of minutes.
How long did it take to find all the bodies and bring them out?
They started the day of, digging through the debris, and it wasn't until May 6th, I believe, when the last brought out. It was around that time. Yes.
My name is Jeff Phillips. I'm a 30-year retiree from Shoemaker Mine, the mine that went through Hitchman and bordered the Benwood Mine. Actually, when it was starting, they went through several old shafts in there, and there were found ripped up belts, old miner hats, and pickaxes. Also, I wanted to thank Mr. Tellitocci there for this informative discussion. What he was saying was the truth, that he really doesn't even know how many people died. Back then, men took their sons in. Men took their kids in there to help work, to get more coal out. You got paid by the ton, not by the stone. So the more kids you could take in there, the more money you made. Also, back then, foreigners were looked down upon. The Americans didn't like foreigners. They didn't like a bunch of Italians, or hunkies, or Polacks. They didn't like them. They used them as mules. That is why there's no real fine count. That's why no one even wants to say they took their kids in there. They don't know, because no one will admit that they took their kids in there. Wheeling Steel didn't want to admit it. Wheeling Steel wanted to say, oh, the mine was in good shape. Evidently it wasn't. And when one of these explosions happen, people, it's not like an explosion here that will kill everyone around. It's like sitting in a shotgun barrel where that explosion, that fire comes zooming through the shotgun barrel and obliterates everything. To find bodies coming out of there is even a miracle. And I wanted to thank Mr. Tellitocci there for bringing all this history, this rich history that we have here, that I no doubt many of the people here are descendants of these good men that were sacrificed for the safety of today's miners.
Any other questions? Yes.
You said some of what I was going to ask, but I'll throw it in anyway. If you don't know how it worked in those days, when you got hired on a mine, and you were the actual miner who got hired on, you got assigned a tag number, you had a stack of But you did the undercutting, you did all the prep work, you had your block, the coal shot down, you did yourself, you loaded. All the hands you could get, just as he says. You took in with you, as soon as your boys got big enough, or in my mom and my Aunt Margie's case, the girls got big enough to go in the mine and shovel coal. You all loaded the pit cars and you hung a tag on it, and you sent it up top. And since it wasn't a union mine, there wasn't any check weighman, the guy looked at it at the top and said, oh, it's half stone, and gave you credit for half of what you loaded. Now, the thing is, that tag went on the car whether there was one grown man in there or whether it was a grown man and 3 kids. It went, the same number would go on if you traded shifts with your neighbor. The same thing would go on if you were sick and your kids went in by themselves. That's why we don't know. I was also told at one point, and I'm saying was told because I can't remember which official it was that told me at Shoemaker that there are still 2 bodies in there in a marked section. It's one of the rooms where it's too unstable to even go in and get them, and it's just marked off. You know where it is because it's...
Yes, I do.
Okay, you know the section well because I've never been able to... I couldn't lay hands on my cap and bring my books. You couldn't look stuff up on the internet. It's never easy enough to do. But that's how it worked. And there's also the issue of the language barrier. It was hard for somebody who didn't speak the native language to try to explain it. My husband, my brother-in-law, I don't know where my oldest son is, and the neighbor went in with them trading shifts. All they're going to be able to figure out is, well, somebody named Duke was missing. So, that's why there's so much confusion. I've heard 124 people missing, I've heard all kinds of figures, but it's somewhere around that. It's 119 you're sure of in a few.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I used to walk through a tunnel from Marshall Street to Boggs Run. Was
Yes.
that connected with the coal mine?
They said that the original history of that tunnel was built to haul limestone through. I think it was the original purpose. And then it basically evolved into a pedestrian walkway. And they sealed it in the highway in 66. And there are a lot of stories about the tunnel. Yes?
I played in that tunnel a lot when I was a kid. Where all the shafts went elsewhere. It went down into lower Benwood. In fact, there was one entrance right above the Benwood called Mother Goose.
Okay.
Remember that?
I wasn't before my time.
There was an entrance there that we used to go back in and play. As we went through the Boggs Run tunnel, there were shafts that went elsewhere, and there was a limestone, I guess, a processor on the other side, on the Boggs Run side. And it was abandoned. And I can remember as a kid, we found some dynamite in there. It was king high powered, 80% gelatin, I can still remember. We were trying to make firecrackers out of it. We sold dynamite, rolling it up in paper, and trying to light it, dynamite.
Yes, for sure. Blasting
But the thing about it was, it's very old and seepage. The nitroglycerin was coming out of it. But that was the mine that was abandoned. A lot of stuff that just left behind. But that was basically a limestone mine, is what it was, with process of making steel.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for coming out today. Parents are back there, family members of mine. For giving me the opportunity to present this program. Thank you very much, Sean. And thanks to everybody for this call.
Dick here to tell you about our happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books has cooks and cooks and hacks and cracks and yarns and sings and rocks and sings and more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with Boggs at the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yoga. Hey, Yogi, 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 hey, Yogi, Yogi, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pop. And it's all free. Lunch with Boggs. Knowledge is served.